Julian thought trading our 10-year marriage for a younger mistress was his greatest investment. He had no idea that I spent every night tracking the $500,000 he drained from our accounts. While he celebrated a pregnancy that was biologically impossible, I was busy auditing his soul. The moment that Dr. gasped, it wasn't because of the baby's beauty. It was the sound of Julian's world finally shattering into pieces. My name is Elena Vance, and at 34 years old, I have spent the better part of a decade dismantling the lies of strangers. As a lead forensic fraud auditor, I am trained to see the microscopic fractures in a person's story, the tiny, jagged edges where the numbers do not quite meet the truth. I have spent my career sitting in cold boardrooms, exposing CEOs who thought they were clever enough to hide their greed. Yet, as I sat on the floor of my hollowed-out Chicago apartment, I realized I had been blind to the greatest fraud of all my own life. The penthouse was skeletal. Julian had taken the mid-century modern chairs, the original oil paintings we bought on our honeymoon in Italy, and even the high-end espresso machine. He left behind the silence and the dust. I looked at the bare walls and began to process the wreckage not with tears, but with the cold, clinical precision of a year-end audit. I viewed our 10-year marriage as a balance sheet that had been bleeding out for years while I was too busy looking at other people's ledgers to notice. Julian's departure 3 days ago had been a performance. He didn't just leave, he delivered a closing argument. I cannot do this anymore. Elena, it is like being married to a ghost, he had said, his voice dripping with a rehearsed kind of pity. You are so dry, so consumed by your work, and the fact that you cannot. You cannot even give me a child. It is just too much. I need warmth. I need a real family. His words were designed to be a killing blow. We had spent 5 years in a grueling cycle of fertility treatments. I remembered the cold steel of the examination tables, the hundreds of hormone injections that left my skin bruised and my moods swinging like a pendulum. I remembered the crushing weight of every negative test result. Each time the doctor shook his head, Julian would pull me into his arms and weep. It is okay. Elena, we will get through this. I love you more than the idea of a kid, he would whisper into my hair, his breath warm against my neck. Now, as I stared at the empty space where our dining table used to be, those memories felt like forged documents. I knew about Chloe. She is 22 years old, a swimsuit model whose primary contribution to society is a curated feed of filtered photos. Julian called her his pure light, a soul untainted by the cynicism of the corporate world. To him, she was a fresh start. To me, she was a liability he could not afford. I did not cry. I have always found that emotions cloud the data, and right now, I needed the data to be crystal clear. I opened my heavy-duty encrypted laptop and felt the familiar hum of the processor beneath my fingertips. It was the only thing in the room that still had a pulse. I began by pulling the records for our joint high-yield savings account. It took me less than 10 minutes to find the hole. $500,000 had been siphoned out over the last 18 months. He had moved it through a web of transfers, small enough to avoid immediate red flags but frequent enough to build a fortune. He had used my own money to buy a luxury condo for his pure light in the Gold Coast. $500,000. You really thought I was too broken to count? I whispered to the shadows of the room. But as I dove deeper into his private servers, bypassing the pathetic passwords he thought were secure, I found the real rot. Julian was not just leaving the marriage with a younger woman. He was planning a hostile takeover of Vance Risk Solutions, the consultancy firm we had built from nothing. I was the brain, the one who did the deep dive investigations, but Julian was the face. He was the one who shook the hands and signed the contracts. I found the encrypted emails to our board of directors. He was painting a terrifying picture of me. He was telling them I had suffered a mental breakdown due to the failed IVF treatments. He claimed I was unstable, that my work was becoming erratic, and that for the safety of our clients, I needed to be removed. He was positioning himself to strip me of my shares and my reputation in one coordinated strike. I leaned back, the blue light of the screen reflecting in my eyes. The coldness I felt was not the absence of heat, but the presence of absolute zero. Julian thought he was leaving a discarded, infertile woman in an empty apartment. He forgot that he had spent 10 years living with a woman who makes a living by making people pay for their mistakes. You want to talk about a real family? Julian, I said, my voice steady and sharp as a scalpel. I am going to make sure the world sees exactly what you are worth. The audit was over. The investigation had begun. I didn't need a child to have a legacy. I just needed to make sure Julian Vance had nowhere left to hide. The ballroom at the Ritz-Carlton was a sea of pastel blues and pinks, a nauseating display of manufactured joy and unchecked ego. Julian always had a penchant for the theatrical, especially when he was the one holding the script. The air was thick with the scent of $500 lilies and the frantic energy of social media influencers looking for the perfect angle. I watched from the edges of the room, a ghost in a perfectly tailored black power suit, as the local tabloids prepared their headlines. They were already calling him the man who finally found his true path to happiness. Chloe made her entrance as if she were royalty being restored to a throne. She was draped in shimmering white silk that flowed over her pregnant silhouette, a calculated move to look like a virgin bride despite the life kicking inside her. On her left hand, a 4-carat pear-cut diamond ring caught the light of the crystal chandeliers, throwing jagged sparks across the room. It was the exact ring I had pointed out in a window on Fifth Avenue 5 years ago. The one Julian told me was an unnecessary vanity while we were trying to save for another round of failed IVF. I waited until the room was at its quietest, just before the appetizers were served, to make my move. As I walked toward the center of the hall, the murmurs followed me like a cold draft. Julian's face didn't just drop, it disintegrated. He looked at me with a mixture of terror and pure, unadulterated hatred. He intercepted me near the champagne tower, his hand catching my wrist with a grip that was meant to be a warning. "Elena, what are you doing here?" he hissed, his voice trembling with a forced composure. "You were not invited. This is a private moment, a family moment. Do not, please, do not make this ugly." I didn't flinch. I let my gaze wander over his expensive tuxedo before meeting his eyes. "I am not here as your ex-wife, Julian. I am here as the 51% stakeholder of Vance Risk Solutions. Half of the people in this room are my employees or my clients. It would be bad for business if I didn't show my face at such a high-profile event." He leaned in closer, his breath smelling of expensive scotch and anxiety. "I am warning you. Stay away from Chloe. This is a sacred day for us. If you ruin this..." "If you say one word to the press about the divorce, I will make sure you never work in this city again." I pulled my arm back gently and adjusted my sleeve. "Sacred. You always did have a flair for the dramatic, Julian." As I moved toward the buffet, Chloe deliberately swerved into my path, her shoulder bumping mine with just enough force to be noticed. She didn't back away. Instead, she leaned in, her smile bright and lethal for the benefit of the cameras nearby. "You really should have stayed in your empty apartment. Elena," she whispered, her voice a sharp contrast to her soft appearance. "It must be so hard, seeing me have everything you couldn't keep. Julian told me how desperate you were, how you cried every time your body failed you. But look at me. This boy in my belly is the only heir the Vance name will ever have. You are nothing but a broken investment." I felt the familiar coldness of a forensic auditor settling over my heart. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small, elegantly wrapped card, placing it on the gift table next to a massive, hand-carved antique cradle I had delivered earlier that afternoon. "Congratulations. Chloe," I said, my voice smooth and loud enough for the guests around us to hear. "I wanted to give you something substantial. That cradle is a 19th century heirloom. It has been through a lot of history. I thought it would be the perfect place for your little miracle to sleep." Julian walked up behind her, his chest puffed out in a display of protective dominance. The lights dimmed, and the music swelled to a crescendo. The crowd began to chant the countdown. 10, 9, 8. Julian pulled Chloe against him, his hand splayed over her stomach as if he were guarding a treasure. "Just get out." "Elena," he muttered under his breath as the chant reached 3. "Go home and accept that you lost. 2, 1. The air exploded with a thunderous pop as dozens of cannons fired. A thick, suffocating cloud of blue confetti rained down from the ceiling, covering the white silk and the expensive diamond in a layer of bright blue paper. The room erupted in cheers. Julian dipped Chloe back, kissing her with a triumphant passion that looked perfect for a magazine cover. He looked up at me through the falling blue dust, his eyes gleaming with the belief that he had finally secured his legacy. He had no idea that the antique cradle in the corner was fitted with a microphone that had just recorded every malicious word they had whispered to me. He thought the blue confetti was a sign of his future. I knew it was just the beginning of his funeral. The fluorescent lights of the Vance Risk Solutions office hummed with a low, predatory vibration that matched the pulse in my temples. It was 2:00 in the morning, the hour when secrets usually crawled out of the shadows to be counted. Marcus sat across from me, his tie loosened and his eyes bloodshot from staring at the glowing spreadsheets. He was the best financial crimes lawyer in Chicago, a man who treated a bank statement like a crime scene. "I followed the trail of the $1,500 you flagged from the offshore account," Marcus said, sliding a thick manila folder across the mahogany desk. His voice was heavy with a hesitation I had never heard before. "It did not go to a shell company or a hidden investment. Elena, it went to a private surgical center in Indianapolis. This was 5 years ago." I opened the folder. My eyes scanned the billing address and the patient name J.V. Sterling. It was a clumsy alias, using Julian's initials and his mother's maiden name. I looked at the date August 24th, 2015. Then I saw the coded line item for the procedure. "Vasectomy," I whispered, the word feeling like shards of glass in my throat. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. 2015. That was the exact month we had sat in our doctor's office, and Julian had held my hand so tightly it bruised, telling me that we would keep trying until we were parents. I felt a sudden, sharp memory of the bathroom floor, the cold tile against my cheek as I sobbed over the 3rd failed round of IVF. I remembered the hundreds of hormone injections I had endured, the way my body bloated and my skin broke out, and the crushing, soul-deep guilt I felt because I thought I was the one who was broken. He watched me," I said, my voice cracking as the realization hit me like a physical blow. He sat there and watched me stab myself with those needles. He watched me cry every single month for 5 years, knowing that I never had a chance. Marcus reached out, his hand hovering over mine but never touching. "Elena, I am so sorry. There is more. Based on the notes from the Indiana clinic, the procedure was permanent. No reversals were ever requested." "He did this right after you both signed the new partnership agreement for the firm." I stood up, pacing the small office as the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with a terrifying rhythmic snap. Julian didn't want a family. He wanted a clean exit in the state of Illinois. Divorcing a woman with children is a messy, expensive ordeal that can drain a man's liquid assets for 21 years by ensuring I remained childless. He ensured that when the day came for him to trade me in, He could walk away with every penny of the company's valuation. He hadn't just stolen my money. He had stolen my time, my health, and the very possibility of the future I had dreamed of. It was a business strategy, I said, a cold, dead laughter bubbling up in my chest. 10 years of marriage. And I was just a liability he was managing. But then, a new thought emerged from the wreckage, sharp and blinding. I looked back at Marcus, my eyes narrowing. If Julian has been sterile since 2015, I started, my mind racing through the timeline of the lavish gender reveal party we had just witnessed. Then that boy Chloe is carrying is not a Vance. It is biologically impossible. Marcus leaned back, a grim smile finally touching his lips. I had the same thought. If Julian believes he is the father, he is being played by the pure light of his life. If he knows he is not the father, he is using the pregnancy as a PR stunt to solidify his image before the board vote. He doesn't know, I said firmly. Julian's ego is his greatest blind spot. He truly believes he is the protagonist of this story. He would never allow another man's child to be the heir to his name, unless he was completely blinded by her. I sat back down, the weight of the betrayal transforming into a focused, incandescent rage. I pulled my laptop closer, my fingers hovering over the keys. Checker. Marcus. I commanded. I want everything on Chloe. I want her school records, her past addresses, and every man she has ever been seen within a 100-mile radius of. No one is that pure, especially not a girl who targets a married man with a $500,000 deficit in his bank account. I spent the next 3 hours digging into the digital ghost of Chloe, the girl who called herself an innocent soul. By 5 a.m, I found the first crack, a deleted social media profile from a small town in Ohio under a different name, a name that didn't belong to a model, but to someone with a much darker history. You wanted an heir, Julian, I whispered to the empty office, my eyes reflecting the harsh blue light of the screen. I am going to give you exactly what you deserve. The truth. The digital world is far more honest than the physical one. While Julian spent his evenings at high-end galas pretending to be a man of integrity, I spent mine submerged in the binary truth of his betrayals. I sat in my darkened study, the glow of 4 monitors reflecting in my glasses. It took me less than an hour to bypass the security protocols of the luxury high-rise on the Gold Coast, the very building Julian bought for Chloe with $500,000 of my money. I moved through the building's internal network until I found the feed for Unit 42B. The camera in the foyer blinked to life, grainy but clear enough to see the reality Julian was too blinded by lust to notice. For the past 3 weeks, every time Julian left for a business trip to New York or San Francisco, the door to 42B opened for another man. He was tall, built with the kind of muscular precision that only comes from hours in the gym, and carried himself with a predatory swagger. His name was Jackson. My background check on him was a list of red flags: a former fitness trainer with a 2-year stint in state prison for a sophisticated credit card skimming operation. I watched the screen as Chloe threw her arms around Jackson's neck, her pregnant stomach pressed against him. There was no pure light in her eyes now, only the cold calculation of a professional grifter. Julian is such an easy mark. He actually thinks I care about his boring stories. Chloe's voice came through the hidden microphone I had installed in the cradle, which she had moved to the living room. Her voice was sharp and mocking. Jackson laughed, pulling her closer. He just signed the transfer for the 20% stake in the holding company. Didn't he? How much longer do we have to play house with this dinosaur? Just until the baby comes, Chloe whispered, her smile lethal. Once the birth certificate is signed and those shares are fully in my name, we drain the offshore account and disappear. He is so desperate for a legacy, he will sign anything I put in front of him. I leaned back, my heart hammering against my ribs. Julian was more than just a fool. He was a walking casualty. He was so convinced of his own charm that he was handing over the keys to the kingdom to a pair of low-level con artists. But the deeper I dug into the company's recent filings, the more my blood turned to ice. Julian hadn't just been moving his own shares. He had been moving mine. I pulled up the digital copies of the transfer deeds for the commercial property on Wacker Drive. There, at the bottom of the page, was my signature. It was a perfect imitation, the kind that would pass a cursory glance. But to my trained eye, the pressure points were all wrong. He had forged my name to bypass the board's approval. "You pathetic, desperate coward," I whispered to the empty room. "You really thought I wouldn't check the audit logs?" I didn't stop there. I began compiling the endgame file. It was a meticulously organized digital bomb. I had the video logs of Chloe and Jackson, the criminal records, the medical history of Julian's vasectomy, and now, the forensic evidence of the forged signatures. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I had kept in my contacts for years, but never thought I would need to use. Sarah Miller, an investigative journalist for the Chicago Tribune who specialized in the dark underbelly of the city's elite. "Sarah, it is Elena Vance," I said when she picked up on the third ring. My voice was as steady as a heartbeat. "Elena, it has been a while. I heard about the split." "I am sorry," Sarah said, though her reporter's instinct already sounded sharp. "Do not be sorry. Just listen," I replied, staring at the image of Chloe and Jackson on my screen. "In about 4 weeks, Julian Vance is going to have the most high-profile birth in the history of this city. I am going to give you the exclusive on what happens in that hospital room." "It is not a birth story, Sarah. It is an autopsy of a fraud that goes back 10 years. I want a front-page spread. I want the headline to be ready before the umbilical cord is even cut. What do you have? Elena?" Sarah's voice dropped an octave, sensing the magnitude of the story. "I have a man who built a life on a lie, a mistress who is stealing his stolen money, and a baby that cannot possibly be his," I said, my eyes cold. "I am going to burn his world to the ground, and I want you there to take the pictures." I hung up the phone. The pressure was building, a digital storm of my own making. Julian thought he was playing a game of chess. He didn't realize I had already hacked the board. The air in the small, upscale bistro on the edge of the loop was thick with the scent of roasted beans and the quiet hum of power lunches. I chose a table in the back, away from the floor-to-ceiling windows, where the light was dim and the shadows were long. I arrived 10 minutes early, a habit born from years of looking for discrepancies in people's timing. When Julian walked in, he wasn't just wearing a suit, he was wearing an armor of victory. He looked polished, successful, and utterly convinced that he had won. He pulled out the chair across from me with a flourish, his gold watch catching the afternoon sun. He didn't look like a man who had just dismantled a decade-long marriage. He looked like a man who had just closed the deal of a lifetime. "You look pale, Elena," he said, his voice carrying a soft, patronizing weight. "It must be so incredibly lonely in that cavernous house now that the movers have finished. I heard you stayed behind to watch them pack. That sounds exhausting." I didn't reach for my coffee. I kept my hands flat on the table, my fingers steady. The house is just wood and stone. Julian. Liquidating it is a simple matter of math. I have the papers for the final sale here. Once we sign, our last tether is officially severed. Julian glanced at the documents with a smirk. "Good. I want this wrapped up before the baby arrives. I have a nursery to furnish, and Chloe has her heart set on a designer set from Paris. It costs nearly $20,000. But for my son, nothing is too much." He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with a cruel sort of pity. "I know it is hard for you to understand. The joy of creating something that is actually yours. I am sorry you had to spend so much time failing at it." I felt a cold ripple of disgust. But I didn't let it reach my face. I simply tilted my head. Creating something is easy, Julian. Sustaining it with the truth is the difficult part. Raising a child, it requires a level of honesty about one's origins that most people are too afraid to face. Genetic legacies have a way of surfacing, even when you try to bury them. Julian let out a sharp, dismissive laugh. He leaned back, crossing his legs comfortably. Is that what this is? Some bitter, pseudo-scientific warning? You are just jealous. Elena, you are a barren auditor who sees the world in black and red ink. Chloe is life. She is fertile. She gave me the one thing you were too dried up to provide. Just accept that you lost the investment. I reached into my bag and pulled out a heavy wooden box containing a bottle of vintage Cabernet Sauvignon. I pushed it across the table toward him. A parting gift, I said calmly, to celebrate your new family. It is a rare vintage, nearly 20 years old. I thought it would suit the occasion. Julian looked at the bottle, then at me, his suspicion warring with his vanity. He opened the box, his fingers tracing the expensive label. As he did, a small, cream-colored business card that I had tucked into the silk lining fell onto the table. It was the card from the andrology clinic in Indianapolis, the one where a man named J.V. Sterling had undergone a permanent procedure 5 years ago. I watched him. The change was subtle, but for a fraud auditor, it was as loud as a gunshot. The blood drained from his cheeks for a fraction of a second. His hand, still resting on the wine box, twitched almost imperceptibly. He recognized the logo. He recognized the name of the lead surgeon. "What is this?" he asked, his voice suddenly losing its resonant, confident edge. It sounded thin, like paper tearing. "Why are you giving me this?" He quickly snatched the card and looked at it, his eyes darting across the text. Then, with a forced, trembling laugh, he crumpled it into a ball and tossed it into the small metal trash bin near the end of the table. "You are truly pathetic, Elena," he spat, though he wouldn't meet my eyes. "Trying to dig up old medical trash, do you think I care about some random clinic? My son is coming in less than a month. Your little mind games are not going to change that reality." I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my blazer. I leaned over the table, bringing my face inches from his. I could smell the sharp, metallic scent of his rising panic beneath his expensive cologne. "Reality is a funny thing, Julian," I whispered, my voice as cold as a winter morning in Chicago. "You can forge a signature, and you can lie to a board of directors, but you cannot negotiate with DNA. The truth always finds a way to reveal itself, usually at the exact moment we think we are most untouchable." Julian didn't answer. He sat frozen, his hand gripping the wine box so hard his knuckles were white. I turned and walked away, the click of my heels echoing against the marble floor. I knew that as he walked out of that bistro, he would feel a cold electric current running down his spine. He would look at Chloe tonight, and for the first time in months, he would wonder if the pure light he had bought was actually a wildfire. He still thought he was the one setting the trap. He had no idea I was the one who had already locked the door. I drove 3 hours south of Chicago to a town that the highway seemed to have forgotten years ago. Oakhaven was a place of peeling gray paint and rusted swing sets, the kind of town people like Chloe spent their whole lives trying to erase. I found the address Marcus had unearthed a dilapidated trailer at the end of a gravel road, surrounded by overgrown weeds and the smell of impending rain. An older woman opened the door, her face a roadmap of hard labor and disappointment. She looked at my designer coat with a mixture of suspicion and a weary kind of hope. This was Margaret, the woman Chloe had abandoned in poverty while she reinvented herself as a high society muse. "I am not looking for trouble, Margaret," I said softly. handing her a photo of Chloe from a recent gala. "I just want to know about her." The woman's hand shook as she took the glossy print. She let out a ragged, bitter sigh. She told the world she was an orphan. Didn't she, that girl? She always was a shark. Her name isn't Chloe, it is Mary Ann. And she didn't just leave this town. She left a trail of ruined lives behind her. Margaret invited me inside, the air smelling of stale cigarettes and cheap tea. Over the next hour, the pure light Julian worshipped was systematically extinguished. Mary Ann had been a professional grifter since she was 19, but the killing blow came when Margaret pulled a weathered shoebox from under her bed. Inside was a legal document that turned my cold blood into ice. It was a marriage certificate, dated 4 years ago, and it was still very much in effect. Mary Ann was married to Jackson. They never got a divorce, Margaret whispered, her eyes filling with a sudden, sharp regret. They were a team. She would find the mark, and he would handle the logistics. I thought she had changed when she stopped calling. But I guess she just found a bigger fish. I left Oakhaven with a digital scan of that certificate. If Julian tried to marry her, he wouldn't just be making a mistake, he would be entering a fraudulent union. Chloe or Mary Ann was a bigamist in the making. Back in the city, the air in my office felt electric. Marcus had been busy while I was away. He had tracked the $2 million Julian had pulled from the firm's liquid reserves over the last 2 months. Julian had told the board it was for a high-yield investment in a tech startup called Ether Solutions. Ether Solutions is a ghost. Elena, Marcus said, pointing at a shell company filing. The CEO is listed as a different name, but the bank accounts are tied directly to Jackson. Julian isn't just being cheated on. He is being robbed blind. He is handing over $2 million to his mistress's actual husband. I leaned over the desk, my eyes scanning the medical portal I had managed to infiltrate. I found the digital uploads of Chloe's ultrasounds. I am not a doctor, but as an auditor, I know how to spot a manipulated timestamp. She had been using a specific hormone therapy to skew the early results, making the pregnancy seem several weeks younger than it actually was to fit Julian's timeline of their affair. "He is going to prison for this," I said, my voice devoid of any warmth. Taking $2 million from a regulated consultancy firm to fund a mistress's lover is not just bad judgment, it is embezzlement and a massive breach of trust. I spent the rest of the night signing the final affidavits. I didn't stop at the company level. I moved into Julian's personal life with the precision of a wrecking ball. I tracked down the private lenders he had borrowed from to fund his new, extravagant lifestyle, the ones he was currently dodging. I didn't report him to them. I did something much worse. I bought his debt. Every cent of the $300,000 he owed in personal loans was now legally owed to me. "I want the paperwork filed by Monday morning," I told Marcus. "I want him to wake up and realize that every breath he takes is subsidized by the woman he tried to destroy." Marcus looked at me, a flicker of something like fear in his eyes. "You are taking everything, Elena. Everything he has." "No," I replied, staring at the glowing skyline of Chicago. "I am just balancing the books. Julian Vance is a deficit that needs to be erased." The phone call came at 3 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks earlier than anyone had anticipated. My contact in the admissions office at Mount Sinai whispered the news into the receiver. Chloe had been rushed in with premature contractions, and Julian was currently pacing the VIP waiting wing like a caged animal. I didn't rush. I dressed with the same methodical care I used when preparing for a high-stakes audit, choosing a navy silk blouse and a charcoal suit that whispered of authority rather than grief. I had spent the last week ensuring that every variable in this equation was under my control. Through a strategic donation to the hospital's research fund and some very specific legal maneuvering, I had managed to have the attending physician replaced. Dr. Aris, a world-renowned specialist in clinical genetics, was now the one in charge of the delivery. He was a man of science who valued data above all else, which made him the perfect instrument for my final audit. On his encrypted tablet lay the medical file I had sent him the records from the Indianapolis clinic detailing Julian's permanent vasectomy and the 0% chance of him fathering a child. When I stepped off the elevator on the 4th floor, the first thing I saw was Julian. He wasn't holding Chloe's hand or speaking to a nurse. He was holding his phone on a gimbal, his face illuminated by the artificial glow of a live stream. "We are so close now. Everyone," Julian said into the camera, his voice a perfect blend of staged anxiety and fatherly pride. "The next generation of the Vance legacy is almost here. To all our investors watching, this is what we build for. This is the future of Vance Risk Solutions." The sight was stomach-turning. He was using a birth a child that wasn't even his to stabilize the company's stock price and distract from the $2 million he had siphoned into Jackson's shell companies. As soon as he spotted me, he froze, abruptly ending the stream and shoving the phone into his pocket. "What the hell are you doing here?" Julian barked, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson. I told you never to come near my family again." "Security. I want this woman removed immediately." He moved toward me, his hands shaking with a cocktail of adrenaline and fear. "You are obsessed, Elena. It is pathetic. You cannot handle that I am having a son and you are nothing but a bitter, lonely auditor. Get out. Before I have you arrested for stalking, I didn't move." I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bound in the blue cover of the Cook County Circuit Court. I handed them to the hospital's head of security, who had arrived just in time to see Julian's outburst. "I am not here as a visitor. Julian," I said, my voice cutting through his panic like a blade. "I am here as the court-appointed monitor for the Vance estate. This is a temporary restraining order and a freeze on all your liquid assets, effective 10 minutes ago. Since you used company funds to pay for this private wing and Chloe's medical expenses, I have a legal right and a fiduciary duty to oversee the expenditure." Julian looked at the papers, his jaw working silently as he tried to process the words. You froze the accounts. How am I supposed to pay for the delivery? You cannot do this. She is in labor. The hospital will be paid. Julian, I will personally ensure the bill is settled, I replied, stepping closer until I could see the sweat beading on his forehead. But every penny will be scrutinized. I am here to make sure no more of my money is used to fund your delusions. A muffled scream erupted from behind the double doors of the delivery suite, followed by the frantic shouting of nurses. Julian turned toward the door, his face a mask of confusion and terror. He looked back at me, his eyes wide. You are a monster, he whispered, his voice cracking. To do this now, while my son is being born. I am just an auditor. Julian, I said, my expression as cold as the hospital's air conditioning. I am just here to see if the assets match the records. Suddenly, the heavy doors swung open. A nurse hurried out, her face pale. She didn't look at Julian, she looked straight at Dr. Eris, who was stepping out behind her, pulling off his surgical mask. From inside the room, a high-pitched, thin cry broke the silence. The baby was here. Julian let out a ragged sob of relief and tried to push past the doctor. Is he okay? Can I see my son? Dr. Eris stayed in his way, his gaze shifting from Julian to the folder I had provided him, then back to the man standing in the hallway. The air in the corridor became thick, heavy with a tension that felt like it was about to snap. Mr. Vance, the doctor began, his voice surprisingly soft but laden with an unmistakable clinical shock. There is something you need to see, something that is quite impossible. The air in the delivery room was heavy and suffocating, a volatile mix of sharp antiseptic and the raw, metallic scent of blood. Julian did not just walk in, He invaded the space, his gimbal-mounted phone held high like a liturgical staff. The bright LED ring light on his device cast a ghoulish, artificial glow over the entire scene, washing out the already pale faces of the medical staff. He was still talking to his digital audience, his voice a frantic, high-pitched hum of self-congratulation. "We are seconds away, everyone." Julian whispered into the lens, his eyes wide with a manic kind of triumph. "History is being made right now. The Vance legacy. It starts with this very breath." I stood just inside the threshold, my arms crossed, a silent observer to the final act of his self-destruction. Chloe lay on the bed, her skin the color of damp parchment and her hair matted with sweat. She looked fragile, but when her eyes flickered toward the door and landed on me, the fragility vanished, replaced by a cold, jagged spike of terror. She knew I wasn't there to offer support. She knew I was the one who had brought the scalpel to her carefully constructed lie. The baby was delivered at exactly 4 minutes past 4 in the morning. The first cry was not the robust wail of a healthy infant, but a thin, reedy sound that seemed to pull the oxygen out of the room. Usually, this is the moment where the nurses begin their rehearsed routine of cleaning and weighing, but the atmosphere shifted instantly. The head nurse stopped mid-motion, her hands hovering over the child, her eyes darting toward Dr. Eris with a look of profound confusion. Dr. Eris stepped forward, his expression unreadable behind his surgical mask. He looked at the baby. Then his gaze moved slowly to the tablet on the bedside table where Julian's medical history, the history I had provided, was glowing in high contrast. I watched as the skin around the doctor's eyes tightened, his brow furrowing into a deep, clinical frown. He looked back at the infant, then at Julian, who was still dancing around the bed with his camera. "Bring him here. Doctor, come on. Let the world see him," Julian urged, his voice cracking with excitement. "Don't be shy. My followers have been waiting 9 months for this moment. Let them see the face of the boy who is going to inherit everything." Julian leaned in. The phone's camera zoomed in on the medical basin. He was grinning, a wide, predatory smile that looked grotesque in the harsh fluorescent light. "Julian, please." "Put the phone down," Chloe whispered, her voice trembling so violently it was barely audible. Just stop for a second. Please, doctor." Eris didn't hand the baby over. He stepped back, a sharp, audible gasp escaping from behind his mask. He looked at the infant again, his head shaking in a slow, rhythmic motion of disbelief. "It is not possible, Doctor," Eris muttered, his voice carrying a weight of shock that silenced the entire room. "Based on the records, based on every biological marker provided for the father, this is medically impossible." Julian's grin didn't just fade, it froze, turning into a rigid porcelain mask of confusion. He lowered the phone slightly, his eyes finally focusing on the child in the basin. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor. "What are you talking about?" Dr. Julian asked, his voice dropping into a dangerous, low register. "That is my son. I am the father. What is wrong with him, Mr. Vance?" "Dr. Eris began, his voice filled with a clinical pity that was more devastating than any insult. "I have looked at your vasectomy records from 5 years ago. I have looked at your current genetic profile, and now—" "I am looking at this child." Julian stepped closer, his phone still recording, and finally, the camera caught what everyone else in the room had already seen. The infant was healthy, but he possessed clear, undeniable genetic traits of a completely different race. The baby's skin was a deep, rich bronze, and his features bore the unmistakable markers of a heritage that was entirely African American, a stark, impossible contrast to the pale Caucasian features of both Julian and Chloe. The silence in the room became a physical weight. Julian's hand began to shake, the gimbal struggling to stabilize the image of the baby that proved, with 100% certainty, that his entire world was a fabrication. He looked at the baby, then at Chloe, who had pulled the white hospital sheet up to her chin, her eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. Chloe. Julian's voice was a ragged, broken ghost of itself. What is this? Why does he look like... He couldn't even finish the sentence. The perfect air, the pure light of his life, and the legacy he had sacrificed his reputation for were all gone in a single, visual revelation. I took a step forward from the shadows, the click of my heels on the linoleum floor sounding like a gavel. "It is called biology, Julian," I said, my voice cold and clear. "And unlike your accounting, it does not lie. There has been a mistake." Julian's voice was a jagged shard of glass, cutting through the sterile silence of the delivery room. He was hyperventilating, the gimbal in his hand shaking so violently that the ring light on his phone created a nauseating strobe effect against the tiled walls. "You swapped them, you incompetent fools. You switched my son. Where is my real child?" Dr. Eris did not flinch. He adjusted his glasses and looked Julian directly in the eye with a cold, professional detachment. The identification bands were placed on the mother and the infant within seconds of the birth. "Mr. Vance, they are a perfect match. There is no error in the delivery. The only error here is your understanding of basic genetics." I took 2 steps forward, moving out of the shadows and into the center of the fluorescent glare. The click of my heels sounded like a gunshot. Julian spun around, his eyes bloodshot and wild. "Turn that camera off!" "Julian," I said, my voice as steady as a surgeon's hand. "Unless you want the 3 million people watching your live stream to witness the exact second your ego dies and your legacy turns into a punchline, turn it off. Now." For a moment, he looked like he wanted to strike me, but the weight of the silence in the room seemed to crush the breath out of him. He fumbled with the screen, his fingers slick with sweat. And finally, the blue light of the recording died. He let the gimbal drop to the floor with a heavy thud. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the manila folder from the Indianapolis clinic. I didn't hand it to him. I threw it onto the foot of the bed where Chloe lay cowering. The papers spilled out, the bold letterhead of the andrology department screaming in the harsh light. "Explain this miracle to me." "Julian," I said, leaning over the bed rail, "you had a permanent vasectomy 10 years ago. August 24th, 2015. I have the surgical logs. I have the post-operative confirmation that your sperm count was exactly 0%. You have spent 5 years watching me bleed and cry through IVF cycles, knowing that you had already sabotaged any chance of me ever becoming a mother. So, please, tell the room how you fathered this child." Julian's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked at the papers, then at his own hands, as if they belonged to a stranger. The realization was visible. It was a physical collapse of his entire reality. Suddenly, a sharp, piercing wail erupted from the bed. It wasn't the baby, it was Chloe. She began to sob, a frantic, ugly sound that had nothing to do with maternal instinct and everything to do with self-preservation. She pointed a trembling finger at Julian, her face contorted with a mask of manufactured grief. "He made me do it!" She shrieked, her voice rising to a frantic pitch. He was so obsessed with having an heir. He was so cold to me. I was so alone and scared. He pressured me to be perfect. I just wanted him to be happy. Julian turned to her, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. You brought another man into our bed. You let me believe. You let the whole world believe. I didn't have a choice, she cried, though we all knew she had made plenty of choices, most of them involving Julian's offshore accounts. The whole world already knows. Julian, I interrupted, pulling a second document from my bag. But they don't just know you are a cuckold. They are about to find out you are a victim of your own arrogance. This is a certified copy of a marriage license from Oak Haven, Ohio. It is still valid. Chloe, or should I say Mary Ann, has been married to a man named Jackson for 4 years. Julian slumped against the wall, his knees finally giving out. He slid down the cold tile until he was sitting on the floor, surrounded by the blue confetti that had stuck to his shoes from the party weeks ago. He was a laughingstock, a man who had traded his life's work for a bigamist who was currently robbing him blind. And as for Jackson, I continued, checking the time on my watch. It is 4:45 in the morning, 10 minutes ago. The Chicago Police Department met him in the hospital lobby. He was waiting for Chloe to give him the signal to drain the last $2 million from your ghost investment account. I provided the detectives with every wire transfer, every forged signature, and every recording from that cradle I gave you. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. The door pushed open, and 2 uniformed officers stood there, their expressions grim. Julian looked up, expecting them to help him, but they didn't even look his way. They walked straight to the bed where the pure light of his life was currently being unmasked as a common criminal. You lost the audit, Julian, I whispered, looking down at the broken man on the floor. And the cost of your fraud is everything you ever owned. As the officers moved in to secure the scene, the silence in the room was broken only by Julian's ragged, uneven breathing. He sat amongst the ruins of his ambition, staring at the infant he had intended to use as a pawn, realizing too late that his perfect future was nothing more than a carefully baited trap. There was no mercy left in me for him. I had already traded my empathy for the cold, hard facts of the ledger I was about to close forever. Julian, look at me, I said, my voice cutting through his heavy, ragged breathing. He looked up, his lip trembling. As of 5 o'clock this morning, the board of directors has held an emergency session. Given the evidence of your embezzlement of $2 million and the blatant violation of our ethical conduct clauses, you are officially terminated from Vance Risk Solutions. Your voting rights are suspended, and I have initiated the buyback clause for your remaining shares at the lowest possible valuation. You can't, Elena. Please, I built that company with you. He stammered, his voice breaking into a pathetic whimper. We were partners for 10 years. You can't just throw me out like trash. You were a partner until you decided to be a parasite, I replied, stepping back as the 2 detectives approached him. You didn't build it. I investigated the frauds, and you simply sold the results. You are replaceable. Julian, the integrity of the firm, however, is not. One of the detectives stepped forward, pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. The sound of the ratcheting metal was the most satisfying thing I had heard in a decade. Julian Vance, you are under arrest for grand larceny, forgery of legal documents, and securities fraud. You have the right to remain silent. Julian didn't fight. He let them pull him to his feet like a rag doll. He looked over at Chloe, who was being guarded by another officer as they prepared to move her for questioning regarding her role in the $2 million investment scam and her bigamous marriage to Jackson. She wouldn't even look at him. She was already calculating her next move, her next lie, her next mark. As they led him toward the door, Julian stopped beside me. His eyes were red, and he looked smaller than I ever remembered. Was it all a game to you, Elena? Did you ever really love me? Or were you just waiting for me to fail? I looked at him for a long moment, feeling the final tether of our history snap. I loved you enough to endure 5 years of needles and hope, Julian. I loved you until I realized that the man I was trying to have a child with was the same man who had ensured I would never have one. You didn't fail, Julian. You were a fraud. And I simply finished the audit. The detectives led him out of the room, his head bowed in a shame that would be broadcast across every news outlet in the city by noon. I felt a profound, heavy silence settle over the room. I didn't feel the sharp, stinging joy I thought I would. I didn't feel the need to scream or celebrate. Instead, I felt a deep, resonant sense of peace. The ledger was finally balanced. I walked down to the hospital lobby, where Marcus was waiting with his laptop open. He looked up and gave me a rare, genuine smile. The $2 million Julian transferred to Jackson's account has been successfully intercepted and moved to a secure escrow. Since Jackson attempted to withdraw it using a flagged fraudulent identity, the funds are being returned to the company's primary reserve. We got it all back. Elena, every single cent? Thank you. Marcus, I said, nodding, make sure the legal team is ready for the fallout. I want the transition to be seamless. I walked out of the hospital's sliding glass doors and into the crisp, cool air of a Chicago morning. The sun was just beginning to peek over the skyline, painting the clouds in shades of gold and soft violet. I took a deep breath, the air filling my lungs with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The ghost of the woman who cried on the bathroom floor was gone. The woman who stood here now was whole, unburdened, and free. By the time I reached my car, my phone was buzzing with notifications. Sarah Miller's article had just gone live. The headline was bold and uncompromising. The fake heir and the $2 million lie. The rise and fall of Julian Vance. By the end of the day, I would be a symbol of a woman who refused to be a victim. But for now, I was just Elena. A few weeks later, I sat in my new office, the windows overlooking the river. The furniture was different, the air was different, and the name on the door was mine alone. I picked up a silver fountain pen and placed it on a document that meant more to me than any corporate merger. It was the founding charter for the Vance Initiative, a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing legal and financial support for women who had suffered from financial abuse and marital fraud. I signed my name with a steady hand. My past was a lesson, my present was a victory, and for the first time in my life, my future was entirely my own. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please let me know in the comments where you are listening from today so we can connect and share our thoughts on Elena's journey. Don't forget to subscribe to the Mia Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support us by hitting the hype button so more people can hear these powerful stories of justice.